Jimmy stared at that temperature gauge needle and felt the weight of every decision he'd avoided for 6 months, pressing down on him like a physical force. The needle continued its slow climb past the caution zone toward the red line that meant imminent engine failure. His training screamed at him to turn back immediately because flying a single-engine Huey over hostile territory with one engine already showing distress was suicidal. But the radio traffic from the ground told a different story, painted in desperate voices and the crackling sound of automatic weapons fire in the background. The forward air controller on station above the LZ was reporting that the perimeter was collapsing, that enemy forces were closing in, that casualties were mounting, that time was measured in minutes not hours. Danny leaned forward from his position at the cargo door and tapped Jimmy on the shoulder. He pointed at the temperature gauge with concern written across his young face. Ray noticed it too, and his body language shifted from alert to tense. Both men were waiting for their pilot to make the call. Jimmy could feel their trust, heavy and undeserved, settling across his shoulders like a yoke. He thought about Sam Delaney grabbing the controls 6 months ago, about those 3 frozen seconds that had defined every moment since, about the man he used to be before fear became his co-pilot. The decision came from somewhere deeper than rational thought. Jimmy pushed the cyclic forward and increased airspeed, committing himself and his crew to the mission despite the warning gauge. He told Danny to watch the engine instruments closely and call out any further changes. He told Ray to get ready because the LZ was going to be hell. Then he switched radio frequencies to contact the ground commander and let him know the ghost pilot was 15 minutes out. The jungle below had gone completely dark now. Jimmy flew by instruments in memory, following a mental map built from dozens of previous missions into this same general area. The temperature gauge continued climbing, but the engine sounded normal to his experienced ear, no unusual vibrations or power fluctuations. Nothing except that damned needle telling him to turn around while there was still time. He began to suspect the gauge might be lying, but he couldn't be certain, and uncertainty in combat aviation killed people with efficient brutality. The forward air controller came up on the radio with an update that made Jimmy's blood run cold. The LZ was taking heavy mortar fire and the enemy had moved machine gun positions to cover the only viable approach corridor. 2 previous helicopter attempts had been driven off by intense ground fire. The wounded were now concentrated in a bomb crater on the northern edge of the clearing, pinned down by enemy forces advancing from 3 sides. The tactical situation had deteriorated from dangerous to nearly impossible in the 20 minutes since Jimmy had lifted off from Da Nang. Ray chambered a round in his M60, and Danny did the same with the weapon mounted on the port side. Both door gunners knew what was coming. Jimmy started descending toward the deck, dropping the Huey down until the skids were almost brushing the treetops, using the jungle canopy as concealment for as long as possible. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady now, acting on trained instinct that bypassed the conscious mind where fear lived. The temperature gauge hit the red line. Jimmy made a decision born of desperation and experience combined. He reached down and pulled the circuit breaker for that particular gauge, killing the false warning. If the engine was truly overheating, it would announce itself through performance degradation or catastrophic failure, not through an instrument he was now convinced was feeding him bad information. The gauge needle dropped to 0 and Jimmy felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of clarity that sometimes comes when all the safe options have been eliminated and only the dangerous path remains. They crossed into the area marked on the map as the AO, the area of operations where friendly and enemy forces were locked in close combat. Jimmy could see the orange glow of explosions ahead, tracers arcing through the darkness, parachute flares drifting down on small parachutes to illuminate the battlefield in harsh white light. The radio erupted with frantic calls for fire support, for medical evacuation, for ammunition resupply, for any kind of help from anyone who could provide it. The ground commander's voice cut through the chaos with map coordinates and a simple message that carried the weight of life and death. 12 men were in that crater, and they had maybe 5 minutes before being overrun. Jimmy keyed his microphone and told the ground commander he was 2 minutes out from the LZ. The response came back skeptical and surprised because nobody expected any helicopter to actually show up under these conditions. The forward air controller offered to make a gun run to suppress enemy fire, but Jimmy declined because the friendlies were too close to the enemy positions and the risk of fratricide was too high. He told the controller to mark the crater with a strobe light and then stay clear because this was going to get messy. The approach corridor was a natural valley between two ridgelines, which made it tactically predictable and therefore perfectly suited for an ambush. Jimmy had no choice but to fly straight down that valley because the surrounding terrain was too steep and the jungle too dense for any alternative route. He dropped even lower until the Huey was flying through the valley at treetop level, using speed and darkness as his only defense. Ray and Danny opened fire with their door guns before any targets were even visible, hosing down the likely enemy positions with suppressive fire in hopes of making the gunners keep their heads down. Then the world exploded into violence and noise. Tracer rounds lit up the night like deadly fireflies, crisscrossing the valley in patterns designed to create an impenetrable curtain of lead. Jimmy heard impacts against the Huey's airframe, metallic pings and thumps that meant bullets were finding their target. He jinked left and right, varying altitude and speed in random patterns, doing everything possible to avoid giving the enemy gunners a predictable target. The Huey shuddered and bucked from the evasive maneuvering, but Jimmy's hands moved with a fluid grace that came from hundreds of hours of muscle memory, his body responding to threats before his conscious mind even registered them. Danny's door gun suddenly went silent. Jimmy glanced back and saw the young crew chief slumped against the bulkhead, blood spreading across his flight suit. Ray was still firing, his M60 hammering away at muzzle flashes in the tree line. But Danny was down and they were still 30 seconds from the LZ. Jimmy shouted into the intercom asking if Danny was alive but got no response. The reality of combat rushed back with savage intensity, the knowledge that people died when he flew, that his decisions had consequences measured in blood and grief. But there was no time for that now. The bomb crater appeared ahead, illuminated by a strobing infrared light, visible through Jimmy's night vision goggles. He could see figures huddled in the crater, some moving, and some terrifyingly still. Mortar rounds were impacting around the perimeter, throwing up geysers of dirt and shrapnel. Machine gun fire raked across the clearing from at least two positions. The LZ was hot in every sense of the word, a killing ground that no rational pilot would attempt to land in. Jimmy flared the Huey hard, bleeding off airspeed, and transitioning from forward flight to a high hover directly above the crater. Ray continued firing, sweeping his gun back and forth to suppress any enemy fighters foolish enough to expose themselves. The helicopter became a stationary target for every weapon in range. Bullets punched through the thin aluminum skin, shattered instruments on the panel, and sparked off the armored seats. Something vital in the transmission made a grinding sound that set off warning lights across the board. The Huey was dying in the air, but Jimmy held it steady, giving the wounded soldiers precious seconds to climb aboard. Ground troops materialized from the crater, dragging and carrying their wounded brothers toward the hovering helicopter. They moved with the desperate speed of men who knew this was their only chance at survival. Jimmy couldn't see them clearly through the darkness and rotor wash, but he could sense the organized chaos below. Medics triaging on the fly, strong men lifting broken bodies, everyone working together with the efficient desperation of soldiers who had practiced this nightmare scenario but never wanted to live it. Ray's gun went silent. At first Jimmy thought the weapon had jammed, but then he heard Ray screaming into the intercom that he was hit. Both door gunners were down now and the Huey had no defensive fire. Enemy troops would realize this quickly and concentrate their fire on the defenseless helicopter. Jimmy held the hover through sheer will and physical strength as the damaged controls fought against him. The cyclic wanted to drift left. The collective was vibrating so badly his entire arm went numb, and the rudder pedals required constant adjustment to keep the nose pointed in the right direction. Bodies were being loaded into the cargo bay. Jimmy couldn't see how many or in what condition. All he knew was that every second in this hover increased the probability of catastrophic failure. The grinding sound from the transmission was getting louder. The oil pressure gauge for the main rotor system was dropping. The Huey was screaming at him through every instrument and control input that it couldn't sustain this much longer. He started counting in his head, giving them 10 more seconds, then 5, then 3. A soldier appeared beside Jimmy's door, his face streaked with blood and dirt, his eyes wild with adrenaline and terror. He gave Jimmy a thumbs up and slapped the side of the helicopter twice. That was the signal. Everyone who could be loaded was aboard. Jimmy didn't wait for confirmation or count heads. He pulled maximum power from the dying engine and hauled the Huey up and out of that crater like he was ripping it away from death itself. The helicopter wallowed into the air, grossly overloaded and severely damaged. Jimmy pointed the nose down the valley they'd come through, trading altitude for airspeed, trying to get clear of the enemy gun positions before something critical failed. Tracer fire followed them, angry red streaks that missed by margins measured in feet and inches. The Huey shook and groaned and threatened to come apart, but it kept flying, kept clawing through the air on nothing but momentum and Jimmy's refusal to let it quit. They made it maybe 2 miles before the transmission seized. Jimmy felt the controls go mushy and unresponsive. The grinding sound became a metallic shriek and then silence as the main rotor stopped receiving power from the engine. They were auto-rotating now, falling out of the sky in a barely controlled descent that would end in either a survivable crash landing or a smoking hole in the jungle. Jimmy searched desperately for anywhere to put down, any break in the triple canopy jungle that might give them a chance. A rice paddy appeared ahead. A small rectangular clearing that looked impossibly tiny from the air, but was the only option available. Jimmy aimed for it with the single-minded focus of a man who had one chance to get this right. The Huey fell faster as he bled off what little forward airspeed remained, trading movement for the rotational energy in the freewheeling main rotor that would cushion their impact. The ground rushed up with terrifying speed. The landing was controlled violence. The Huey hit hard enough to collapse the landing gear and buckle the floor panels. The fuselage skidded across the muddy water of the rice paddy, throwing up a spray of liquid and vegetation. Metal screamed and tore. The windscreen shattered. Then everything stopped moving. And for a moment there was absolute silence, except for the ticking sound of hot metal cooling and someone groaning in pain from the cargo bay. Jimmy sat frozen in his seat, hands still locked on the controls, unable to process what had just happened. They were alive, against all probability and logic. They were alive. He forced himself to move, to unbuckle his harness, to turn around and check on his crew and passengers. The cargo bay was a nightmare of tangled bodies and medical equipment. Danny was unconscious but breathing. Ray was clutching his leg and cursing steadily in Spanish. The wounded soldiers they'd extracted were in various states of consciousness, but all of them were alive. Ground forces reached them within 20 minutes. A search and rescue helicopter picked up the survivors an hour later. Jimmy flew back to Da Nang in the cargo bay of a Chinook, sitting among the men he'd saved, listening to them thank him and call him a hero and tell him he'd done the impossible. He accepted their gratitude with numb detachment, still processing the fact that he'd flown the entire mission despite believing his engine was failing, despite watching both his crew members get shot, despite crashing in the jungle. The official after-action report praised Captain Caldwell's extraordinary courage under fire and recommended him for the Silver Star. It described how he'd flown into a hot LZ despite mechanical problems, how he'd maintained position under heavy fire after both door gunners were incapacitated, how he'd successfully extracted 12 wounded soldiers and then performed a masterful forced landing when his helicopter's transmission failed. The report made him sound like exactly the kind of fearless pilot the Ghost pilot was supposed to be. What the report didn't mention was the faulty temperature gauge. That detail would remain buried in maintenance records for 40 years until a researcher writing a book about Vietnam helicopter operations discovered the discrepancy. The gauge had been malfunctioning for weeks before Jimmy's mission, occasionally showing false high temperature readings that maintenance had documented but never fixed. Jimmy had flown the entire mission believing his engine was on the verge of failure when in reality the power plant had been running perfectly normal right up until the moment the transmission gave out from battle damage. What the report also didn't mention was that Jimmy Caldwell never flew combat missions again. The crash had aggravated old injuries from the November incident, and medical gave him a permanent grounding. He spent the rest of his tour training new pilots, passing on lessons learned from 800 hours of combat flying, teaching them how to survive in the worst helicopter war anyone had ever fought. The younger pilots hung on his every word and called him a living legend, and asked him to tell stories about the night he flew into hell and brought 12 men back out. Jimmy told them the stories they wanted to hear, but he left out the parts about fear and doubt and the paralysis that had nearly ended his career. He never mentioned Sam Delaney grabbing the controls or the 6 months he spent finding excuses to avoid dangerous missions. He definitely never told them about the 3 seconds of frozen terror that came before every moment of courage. The official narrative was simpler and cleaner, a story of unshakable bravery and supernatural flying skill. Danny Pritchard recovered from his wounds and went home to Tennessee, where he married his high school sweetheart and opened a garage. Ray Martinez spent 3 months in a hospital in Japan before being medically discharged. He went back to Los Angeles and became a police officer. Both men stayed in touch with Jimmy for the rest of their lives. Neither of them ever learned about the faulty gauge or the real reason Jimmy had been so reluctant to fly that night. The 12 soldiers Jimmy pulled out of that crater all survived. Some returned to duty, and some went home. One of them became a doctor. Another taught history at a community college. A third worked construction and raised 4 kids. They scattered across the country after the war ended, but they stayed connected, calling each other on birthdays and holidays, meeting up at reunions every few years. They always invited Jimmy, but he rarely attended. He told them he was busy with work or family or other commitments. The truth was that seeing them reminded him of the man he'd been that night, the pilot who'd done the impossible despite being terrified every second of the flight, and that man felt like a stranger Jimmy didn't quite recognize anymore. 43 years after that night over Da Nang, a military historian researching helicopter operations in Vietnam, came across the maintenance records for Jimmy's Huey. The historian noticed the documented gauge malfunction and realized that Captain Caldwell had flown the entire mission under the false belief that his engine was failing. This revelation changed the historian's understanding of what had actually happened. The courage required to fly that mission with a dying engine was extraordinary. The courage required to fly it believing the engine was dying but not knowing for certain was something else entirely. A different kind of bravery that involved accepting uncertainty and choosing to trust instinct over instruments. The historian tracked down Jimmy, who by then was 70 years old and living in Florida. They met at a small diner near Jimmy's retirement community. The historian explained what he'd discovered about the gauge and asked Jimmy if he'd known it was malfunctioning. Jimmy sat quietly for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup, processing information that recontextualized the defining moment of his life. He finally admitted that he'd suspected the gauge was wrong but couldn't be sure, that he'd made the decision to continue based on instinct and desperation rather than certainty. The historian asked Jimmy why he'd never flown combat missions again after that night. Jimmy hesitated, then told a version of the truth that he'd never shared with anyone except Sam Delaney, who had died in a car accident in 1989. He talked about the November incident and the 3 frozen seconds. He described the 6 months of fear and avoidance. He explained how the April mission had forced him to confront everything he'd been running from. He said that crash landing in the rice paddy had felt like reaching the end of something, like he'd used up whatever reserves of courage he'd possessed, and there was nothing left for future missions. The historian published his book 2 years later. The chapter about Jimmy became one of the most discussed sections. Veterans who'd flown in Vietnam recognized the truth in Jimmy's story. The gap between the heroic narrative and the messy reality of fear and doubt that existed behind every act of courage. The book prompted several of the 12 men Jimmy had saved to reach out to him again. They wanted him to know that learning about his fear didn't diminish what he'd done. If anything, it made the rescue more remarkable because he'd done it despite being terrified, rather than because he felt no fear. One of those men, a former sergeant named Mike Kowalski, who'd gone on to become a high school principal, wrote Jimmy a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Mike explained that he'd been in that bomb crater assuming he was going to die, that he'd heard the Huey coming and couldn't believe any pilot would actually land in that inferno, that the sound of rotor blades overhead was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Mike wrote that every year on the anniversary of the rescue he thought about the unnamed pilot who'd saved his life and wondered what kind of person had that much courage. Now that he knew the fuller story, Mike wrote, his gratitude had somehow deepened. The image of Captain Caldwell sitting in that cockpit, watching warning gauges and listening to battle damage impacts, choosing to continue despite every rational reason to turn back, that image meant more than any tale of fearless heroism ever could. Mike ended the letter by saying he was grateful Jimmy had been scared that night, because it meant the choice to continue had been a real choice, a conscious decision to face death rather than an instinctual response uncontaminated by doubt. Jimmy kept that letter in his desk drawer. He took it out sometimes and read it when the memories got too heavy, when the what-ifs and might-have-beens threatened to overwhelm the reality of what actually happened. The letter helped him understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear's presence. That night over Da Nang hadn't been about supernatural flying skills or fearless determination. It had been about a terrified man choosing to do his job when everything inside him screamed to run away. The faulty gauge became a metaphor for Jimmy's entire war experience. He'd flown hundreds of missions based on imperfect information, making life and death decisions with incomplete knowledge, trusting instruments that might be lying and instincts that might be wrong. Every combat pilot did the same thing every single day. The ghost pilot nickname suggested someone who operated outside the normal rules of physics and probability. But the truth was much simpler and somehow more profound. Jimmy had just been a regular pilot who showed up and did his job day after day until the war ended, or he couldn't fly anymore, whichever came first. Danny Pritchard read the book when it came out, and called Jimmy immediately. They hadn't spoken in almost 5 years, but Danny wanted Jimmy to know that learning about the faulty gauge didn't change anything about that night. Danny said he'd watched Jimmy fly through impossible situations so many times that one more miracle had just seemed like routine. He said the crew chiefs and door gunners all knew their pilots were scared because they were scared too, but they also knew that when the radio called for help, the ghost pilot would always show up. Ray Martinez sent a shorter message through Facebook. He said the book explained a lot about why Jimmy had seemed different after the crash, quieter and more withdrawn. Ray said he'd always wondered if something had broken inside Jimmy that night, some internal mechanism that allowed him to keep flying into danger without thinking too hard about the consequences. Ray wrote that he respected Jimmy's decision to stop flying combat missions because staying in the fight when your nerve was gone would have gotten people killed. Jimmy appreciated both messages, but he wasn't sure either man fully understood. The issue hadn't been nerve or courage in any simple sense. It was more like he'd discovered during that final mission just how thin the line was between heroism and disaster, how much of combat aviation depended on luck and timing and factors completely outside a pilot's control. The faulty gauge had been a perfect symbol of that randomness. He'd made the right decision for the wrong reasons based on incorrect information, and everything had worked out anyway. That kind of arbitrary chance was terrifying in a way that enemy fire had never been. The 12 men he'd saved started a tradition of calling Jimmy every April on the anniversary of the rescue. The first few years he found the calls difficult because they forced him to revisit memories he'd rather leave undisturbed. But as time passed and the sharp edges of trauma wore down into softer shapes, he began to appreciate the ritual. These men were living proof that his fear and doubt hadn't prevented him from doing what needed to be done. Their voices on the phone, talking about grandchildren and retirement plans and health problems, grounded the abstract horror of that night in concrete evidence of lives lived and families built. Mike Kowalski organized a reunion in 2015 specifically to honor Jimmy. All 12 men attended along with their families. They presented Jimmy with a plaque that listed their names and included a simple inscription that read, "You gave us tomorrow." Jimmy gave a short speech where he thanked them for their service and tried to deflect attention back onto their own courage under fire. But afterward, when the formal program ended and people mingled over barbecue and beer, several of the men pulled Jimmy aside to share their own stories of fear and doubt during the war. One man admitted he'd almost refused to go out on patrol the day he got wounded because he'd had a bad feeling about the mission. Another confessed that he'd frozen during his first firefight and only survived because his sergeant grabbed him and physically dragged him to cover. A third described how he still had nightmares about specific moments from that night in the crater. How he sometimes woke up convinced he'd died in Vietnam and everything since had been a dying dream. Jimmy listened to these confessions and realized he wasn't alone in carrying the weight of imperfect courage. The reunion marked a turning point in how Jimmy thought about that final mission. He'd spent 45 years viewing it through a lens of shame and inadequacy, convinced that his fear had somehow tainted what should have been a straightforward story of military heroism. But hearing these other veterans describe their own struggles with terror and doubt helped him understand that fear was the universal constant of combat, the shared experience that connected every soldier regardless of rank or role or the specific circumstances of their service. Jimmy started attending more veterans events after that. He joined a local Vietnam veterans chapter and volunteered at the VA hospital. He found that talking about his experiences helped other veterans open up about their own struggles. The ghost pilot legend had made him unapproachable for decades, an impossible standard that other pilots felt they could never meet. But the real Jimmy Caldwell, the scared man who'd flown anyway, that person was someone other veterans could relate to and learn from. The historian's book had one final impact that Jimmy never anticipated. A documentary filmmaker optioned the helicopter chapter and produced a short film about the April mission. The filmmaker tracked down several of the soldiers from that night and interviewed them about their memories. He also got extensive interviews with Jimmy, where the old pilot finally told the complete story, including all the parts he'd left out of previous tellings. The documentary premiered at a film festival in 2018. Jimmy attended with his wife and adult children, who'd heard pieces of the story over the years, but never the full narrative. Watching the film with his family in the darkened theater, seeing his younger self recreated through archival footage and dramatic reenactments, Jimmy felt a strange sense of completion. The scared 25-year-old pilot and the 73-year-old veteran were finally integrated into a single coherent person instead of two separate identities that had never quite reconciled. After the screening, during the Kunda session, a young Army helicopter pilot stood up and asked Jimmy what advice he'd give to pilots deploying into combat zones. Jimmy thought carefully about his answer. He could have offered technical advice about tactics and procedures. He could have emphasized physical skills and mental preparation. Instead, he talked about fear and how to recognize it without letting it control your decisions. He said the greatest danger wasn't being afraid, but pretending you weren't, lying to yourself until the fear metastasized into paralysis at the worst possible moment. The young pilot nodded slowly and sat back down. Jimmy couldn't tell if his answer had been helpful or even made sense to someone who hadn't yet experienced sustained combat operations. But several older veterans came up afterward to thank him for his honesty. One retired Air Force pilot said he'd spent 30 years thinking he was the only one who'd ever been terrified in the cockpit. Another man who'd flown rescue missions in Iraq said Jimmy's story about the faulty gauge had helped him understand his own experiences with equipment failures and uncertainty. Jimmy died in 2022, at the age of 77 from complications related to cancer. His obituary mentioned his Silver Star and his service in Vietnam, but didn't go into detail about specific missions. The local newspaper ran a longer feature that included quotes from several of the men he'd saved and referenced the historian's book. The funeral was well attended, with veterans from multiple conflicts showing up to honor one of their own. During the service, Mike Kowalski gave a eulogy that captured something essential about Jimmy's character. Mike talked about courage and fear as inseparable qualities, two sides of the same coin that couldn't exist without each other. He said Jimmy had taught them all that heroism wasn't about being unafraid but about choosing to act despite fear's presence. Mike ended by noting that every person in that funeral home owed their presence to someone who'd made a hard choice in a moment of uncertainty, and that debt of gratitude rippled outward through families and communities in ways that could never be fully measured or repaid. The story of the ghost pilot and the faulty gauge became a teaching example at several military flight schools. Instructors used it to illustrate the importance of trusting your instincts when instruments contradicted common sense, and also the danger of overriding legitimate warnings because you wanted to be brave. The mission existed in that narrow space between foolhardiness and courage where most real heroism actually occurred, in the ambiguous middle ground where perfect information wasn't available and the correct choice wasn't obvious until long after the moment had passed. Danny Pritchard kept in touch with Jimmy's family after the funeral. He sent them copies of old photographs from their time in Vietnam, images of a young crew chief and his pilot standing beside their helicopter, both men grinning despite the war happening all around them. In one photo, Jimmy's hand rested on the Huey's fuselage just above a patch of bullet holes that maintenance hadn't yet repaired. Danny remembered taking that picture the morning after the April mission, how Jimmy had seemed both exhausted and somehow lighter, like a weight had been lifted, even though the physical and emotional toll was obvious. Ray Martinez wrote an article for a veterans magazine about his experiences as a door gunner. He devoted several paragraphs to the April mission and his relationship with Jimmy. Ray described watching his pilot hold that impossible hover while bullets turned their helicopter into Swiss cheese. How Jimmy's hands never wavered despite the damage accumulating around them. Ray wrote that he'd flown with other pilots before and after Jimmy, good men who knew their business, but none of them had possessed that particular combination of skill and determination that defined the ghost pilot in Ray's memory. The 12 men who'd been pulled from that bomb crater continued their tradition of calling each other on the anniversary even after Jimmy died. They added a moment of silence to remember their pilot, a small ritual that honored the man who'd given them the chance to grow old. Their children and grandchildren knew the story, passed down as family history, a reminder that someone else's courage in a long-ago war had made possible all the birthdays and graduations and weddings that came after. The faulty temperature gauge ended up in a military museum as part of an exhibit on Vietnam helicopter operations. A small placard explained its significance and told the basic outline of Jimmy's story. Visitors could see the actual gauge with its frozen needle and understand that Captain James Caldwell had flown one of the war's most daring rescue missions while believing his engine was failing. That he'd chosen to continue despite instruments screaming at him to turn back. That fear and courage had coexisted in his cockpit throughout that impossible night. What the museum exhibit couldn't capture was the private struggle that preceded and followed that moment of public heroism. The 6 months of fear and avoidance. The 3 frozen seconds from the November incident. The grinding guilt over Sam Delaney's secret intervention. The decades of wondering if he'd done enough, or been brave enough, or measured up to the reputation that preceded him. Those internal battles didn't make for good museum displays, but they were as much a part of the story as the dramatic rescue itself. Years after Jimmy's death, one of his granddaughters found his old flight logs in a storage box. She read through the entries carefully, noting the brief descriptions of missions flown and hours logged and weather conditions encountered. The entry for April 17th was longer than most. Jimmy had written a detailed account of the mission, including his decision to ignore the temperature gauge and his doubts about whether he'd made the right call. The log entry ended with a simple sentence that his granddaughter found both heartbreaking and profound. Jimmy had written that being afraid didn't make you a coward as long as you still did your job. That insight, written by a young pilot processing trauma in the privacy of his flight log, became the lasting legacy of the ghost pilot. Jimmy Caldwell didn't overcome his fear through some act of superhuman will. He just chose to do what needed doing despite being terrified. He flew into danger when every instinct told him to run. He held position under fire when self-preservation screamed at him to escape. He saved 12 lives because those lives needed saving, and he was the only one available to try. The story spread through military communities and veteran organizations, passed along as a teaching example and a source of comfort. Pilots facing their own doubts found reassurance in knowing that even legendary figures like the ghost pilot had struggled with fear. The faulty gauge became a metaphor for the incomplete information and uncertainty that defined so much of military service. Jimmy's choice to continue despite that uncertainty represented the kind of pragmatic courage that won wars, the unglamorous decision to show up and do your job when everything was uncertain and nothing was guaranteed. In the end, what happened over Da Nang that night wasn't about supernatural flying skills or fearless determination. It was about a regular person confronting extraordinary circumstances and choosing to try despite overwhelming odds and legitimate terror. Jimmy Caldwell was the ghost pilot not because he felt no fear but because he flew anyway. Carried forward by duty and desperate hope that maybe this time everything would work out and the people depending on him would live to see another day. That was the real miracle, repeated countless times throughout that long war by pilots and soldiers whose names would never appear in history books. but whose courage in moments of fear made all the difference to the people who survived, because someone chose to try. Retry.